A tower leans against a gray sky 8 degrees off true and has not fallen in 60 years. Wide over flat farmland, first nothing but grain silos and one white church steeple against clouds that can't decide what they want to do. Then closer, a dead-end street lined with elms, and at the end of it rising past every rooftop around it, something that shouldn't still be standing. 3 towers, one central spire tall enough to pierce the clouds. Stained glass at the top, catching gray light in fractures of red and blue through 60 years of dust. 3 engineers refused to certify it. Somewhere behind a wall on the 3rd floor, sealed shut and plastered over decades ago, something has been waiting in the dark this whole time. A woman's hand reaches for a brass key sitting exactly where someone left it. The lock resists, then turns. The mug said, "World's best grandma." Ruth held it like it might still be warm. It wasn't. Nothing in that kitchen was warm anymore. Not the coffee going cold in the pot. Not her son's voice. "It's already listed, Mom." Bradley didn't look up from his phone. "Closing's in 3 weeks." 3 weeks. For a house she'd lived in for 46 years. Frank stood by the window watching a stranger tape a real estate sign to their own mailbox. 74 years old. Still had the shoulders of a man who used to climb scaffolding for a living. Still couldn't stop this. "Your mother's piano," Frank said. Quiet, careful. "It doesn't fit on a moving truck to nowhere, Bradley." "The buyer doesn't want it." Bradley finally looked up. "Dad, we've been over this. The equity from this house is the only real plan you two have left. Each of us." That's what he'd said last week. Not you and Mom, each of us. Split 3 ways so his sister Carol and his brother Mitchell could each take their share and never have to think about any of this again. Ruth set the mug down. Her knuckles ached just from holding it. 5 years since the arthritis took her hands away from her. 5 years since she stopped being a piano teacher and started being just a woman who used to be one. She walked into the living room. The piano sat there. Upright, scratched along the left leg from the time Bradley, age 9, had crashed his bike into it. 41 years old now. Didn't remember. Or didn't want to. She ran one stiff finger along the closed lid. Because that piano had heard every scale her students ever stumbled through. Because it had heard her cry the night her own mother died. Because it had heard silence too, 5 years of silence since her hands stopped working the way hands are supposed to work. And now a stranger was going to haul it away in a truck. "Movers will deal with it," Bradley said from the doorway. He wasn't cruel. That was the terrible part. He wasn't cruel. He was just done looking. Ruth didn't answer him. She went upstairs instead, started folding things into a suitcase. A life, 46 years of it, folded down into 2 bags and whatever fit in the trunk of a Buick that Frank had bought used in 2009 and never once complained about. Her hands moved slow over the fabric. Slow because they had to. Slow because fast hurt. She thought about her students, the ones who won competitions. The one who got into Juilliard on a scholarship sent her a card every Christmas for 6 years and then stopped. She thought about her daughter Carol, who lived 40 minutes away in a house with 4 empty bedrooms and somehow didn't have room for 2 more people. The timing wasn't good, Carol had said on the phone, as if grief had a schedule, as if losing a home came with an appointment window. And Mitchell, her other son, he'd changed his phone number, sent one text after, a list of senior communities, 18-month waiting list on the good ones. So that left Bradley's assistant an email, a spreadsheet of subsidized housing sorted by zip code like her whole life could fit into a filterable column. Frank found her sitting on the edge of the bed an hour later, suitcase half full, hands in her lap. "Where do we go?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He never did, not when it mattered. He just sat down beside her. The mattress dipped under both of them the way it had for 30 years. "East," he said finally. "There's nothing east of us." "I know." "Then why east?" "Because west was Bradley. because north was Carol's empty bedrooms that weren't empty for them, because south was Mitchell, who didn't answer anymore. So east, because it was the only direction that didn't already say no. They left the next morning before the movers arrived. Didn't watch them carry out the piano. Ruth couldn't. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded and her eyes forward and let Frank drive. 3 hours of flat road. Small towns bleeding into each other through the windshield like watercolor left out in rain. Gas stations, grain silos, a billboard for a lawyer that had clearly been up since the Clinton administration. They stopped in a town called Caulfield because the gas gauge said they had to, and because it was the first exit in 20 miles that had a station still open. Population 2,000, the sign said. Looked like it hadn't believed that number in years. Main Street had a hardware store, a post office, a church with a steeple so white it looked freshly painted against a sky that had given up trying, and a diner, Whitlock's. Ruth needed the restroom. That was the whole plan. Walk in, use the restroom, walk out. Keep driving toward a direction that didn't have an answer yet. Except the woman behind the counter looked up the second the bell over the door rang, and something in her face didn't do the thing most faces did lately. It didn't flinch. It didn't calculate. It didn't look at two old people walking in with tired eyes and immediately start doing math about what they needed and how much trouble they'd be. Regular or decaf? The woman asked. Coffee pot in each hand like she'd been born holding them. Just the restroom, Frank said, if that's all right. Sit first. She was already pouring. You look like you've been driving a while. Her name was Nora Whitlock. She'd owned that diner for 30 years, and she had the specific gift of not asking questions she didn't need the answers to. She brought them coffee, brought them pie, blueberries still warm. When Frank reached for his wallet, she just shook her head once, like the matter had already been settled somewhere Frank wasn't invited to argue. First-timers eat free, she said. Is that a real policy? It is now. That was how they found this town. Not on a map, not on purpose. A woman with 2 coffee pots and a rule she'd invented on the spot 30 seconds after meeting them. Ruth saw the flyer on her way to the restroom, taped to a corkboard by the door, curling at the corners like it had been there since before the internet existed. Caulfield County Tax Auction. Saturday 10 a.m., County Courthouse. 13 properties. Her eyes moved down the list. Empty lots, a few structures in various stages of falling down. And at the bottom, in smaller print, like even the flyer was embarrassed by it. Winterbourne Estate, circa 1887. Condemned. No utilities. Structural assessment, unknown. Minimum bid $12. $12. For a house. She said it out loud without meaning to. $12. Nora appeared behind her with the coffee pot, refilling a cup that didn't need refilling yet, the way people do when they want an excuse to stand near you a little longer. That's the Winterbourne place, Nora said. Been sitting empty about 60 years now. 60 years? Give or take. Kids around here say it's haunted. Is it? Nora shrugged the kind of shrug that had answered this exact question 100 times before. Every old house makes noise at night. People hear what they already decided to hear. Ruth looked at the flyer again, at the number, $12. She thought about the piano somewhere on a truck right now being hauled toward a life she wasn't part of anymore. She thought about her hands. She thought about the word Bradley used, each of us, not you and Mom. She walked back to the booth, sat down across from Frank. Didn't say anything for a second. We don't have anywhere else to go, she said finally. Frank looked at her carefully, the way he used to look at a wall before he decided whether it could hold weight. I know. $12, Frank. I know. She picked her fork back up, took another bite of pie because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. It's probably terrible, she said. Probably. She set the fork down. Let's go look at it. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old coffee that had been reheated one too many times. 30 people, maybe. Metal folding chairs. A woman in a gray blazer reading property descriptions off a clipboard in a voice that had long since stopped pretending to be interested in any of it. The lots went first. Cheap. A man in overalls bought 3 for $15 each and didn't even stand up to do it. Then, Winterbourne Estate, the auctioneer said. Flat, practiced. Approximately 5,000 square feet, 3 stories plus a central tower. Condemned by the county in 1988. No water, no electric, no gas. Roof status unknown. Foundation status unknown. A pause. Starting bid $12. A man 3 rows back turned around and grinned at the whole room like he just told a joke everyone should already know the punchline to. That's the haunted house. Laughter. Small. Cruel in the casual way small towns are cruel without meaning to be. The auctioneer waited. Scanned the room the way you scan a room when you already know what you're going to find. Nothing. She picked up her pen to mark it unsold. Ruth's hand went up before she told it to. The room went quiet. Not slow. Not gradual. All at once, like someone had shut a door somewhere and the sound had nowhere left to go. $12, Ruth said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, steadier than she felt. For the house. The auctioneer looked at her over her glasses the way people look at something they need to double-check is real. Ma'am, you understand this property is condemned. The county makes no guarantees regarding structural integrity or habitability. I understand. There's no utilities connected. Reconnection requires a structural certification from a licensed engineer. Ruth looked at Frank. Frank looked back at her. Something passed between them that didn't need words. 46 years of marriage had built a language that didn't require sentences anymore. My husband is a licensed structural engineer, Ruth said. Retired. The auctioneer blinked, looked down at her clipboard, looked back up. $12, she said to the lady in the back. Nobody challenged it. Nobody even considered it. Ruth walked up, signed 3 pages she barely read, and received a single brass key on a plain metal ring. It weighed almost nothing. It felt like it weighed everything. The auctioneer shook her hand. Good luck, she said. She didn't sound like she meant it. They drove toward the address with the windows down the way you do when you're afraid that if you close them, you'll have too much time to think about what you just did. The street was lined with old elms, the kind that had probably been saplings when the houses around them were framed. Small homes, neat yards, porches with hanging plants, and American flags. Except the last one. Ruth saw it before Frank slowed the car. Before either of them said a word. She saw it and her whole chest did something strange, something between recognition and disbelief. The kind of feeling you get standing at the base of a mountain you didn't know was there. It wasn't a house. It was a tower. No towers, 3 of them. One rising from the center of the structure so tall it seemed to pierce straight through the low-grade clouds, capped in a peaked roof gone the color of old pennies green, black with decades of weather. 2 smaller towers flanked it on either side, twin peaks like something out of a story meant to frighten children into staying close to their parents at bedtime. The whole structure leaned, not collapsed, leaned. A slow, deliberate tilt to the left, maybe 8 degrees, maybe more, the kind of angle that should have brought the entire thing down decades ago and simply hadn't. Frank parked at the curb, didn't get out right away, just sat there with both hands still on the wheel, staring up through the windshield like a man doing math he couldn't make add up. That's not in the photo, he said. There was no photo. There should have been a photo. The porch wrapped the entire structure, all 4 sides held up by what must have once been 100 carved columns. Half of them had rotted through at the base and collapsed inward so that the whole porch looked like the rib cage of something enormous that had simply lain down one day and never gotten back up. Windows climbed the towers in narrow arched shapes, and near the very top of the central spire, stained glass caught the gray afternoon light and threw it back in fractured colors. Deep red ink blue, despite 60 years of dust thick enough to feel from the sidewalk. Ruth got out of the car slowly. Her hands found each other, fingers laced the way they did when she was trying not to shake. Because it looked, she thought. It looked like she didn't finish the thought. Couldn't. It felt foolish even forming it. But she looked at that tilted, towering, impossible structure, and something in her chest recognized it. The way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years before you even know the name of the song. It looked like a piano. A grand piano tipped on its side keys, scattered lid thrown open to the sky. Massive. Silent. Something built to make sound that had simply forgotten how for a very long time. Ruth. Frank's voice pulled her back. He was standing beside her now, hands in his pockets, head tilted up at an angle that matched the house's own lean, like he was trying to see it the way it saw itself. Nobody in Caulfield could explain why it hasn't fallen, he said quietly. Auctioneers said 3 engineers turned this place down before you raised your hand. 3. 3. Wouldn't certify it, wouldn't touch it. He shook his head slowly, and there was something in his face Ruth hadn't seen in years. Not fear, something closer to wonder. A lean like that should have brought this whole thing down before either of us was born, Ruth. And it's still standing. Maybe it has a reason. She said it before she could stop herself. Frank looked at her sideways. Houses don't have reasons, Ruth. No, she said. I suppose they don't. But she didn't quite believe herself even as she said it, and some small, stubborn part of her noticed that Frank didn't argue the point any further either. They climbed the porch steps together, Frank testing each board with his weight before committing his full frame to it. The old habit of a man who'd spent 40 years making sure floors could hold what stood on them. Ruth followed a half step behind one hand, trailing along a railing gone gray and splintered with age. The key stuck in the lock, fought them, then turned. The door swung inward on a groan that seemed to travel up through all 3 towers at once, and the smell came first. Dust, old wood, and something underneath it faint and sweet, like flowers pressed flat between the pages of a book nobody had opened in decades. The foyer swallowed the daylight whole. Frank found a shuttered window and forced it open, and sunlight cut across a floor buried under 60 years of grime, revealing dark wood beneath a staircase, rising along the far wall in a spiral that seemed to climb forever, disappearing up into shadow toward the tower Ruth had seen from the street. The bones are good, Frank murmured, running one palm flat against the nearest wall. Testing, listening with his hands the way he always had. You can tell that already. I can tell that already. Ruth walked further in. A parlor opened to her left, ceilings so high they seemed to belong to a church rather than a home. A fireplace large enough to stand inside sat cold and dark against the far wall, its mantle still holding a row of small ceramic figures too coated in dust to make out. She reached out and touched the mantel, left a clean line through the gray with one finger. Someone lived here, she said. Someone loved this place. Frank had already moved past her tapping walls, listening for the hollow sound of rot, the way other men might listen for a heartbeat. He found the cellar stairs and disappeared down into the dark with a flashlight, and Ruth stood alone in the parlor for 10 minutes listening to the house settle around her. Until Frank came back up, dust on his shoulders, something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Stone foundation, he said. Original framing, hand-hewn. No visible cracks anywhere I could reach. The lean structural, not failure. Whoever built this compensated for something in the ground, some kind of shift, and built around it instead of against it. He shook his head again, slower this time. Whoever built this house built it to outlast every one of us standing in it right now. And we got it for $12, Ruth said. We got it for $12. They slept that first night on sleeping bags Frank had picked up from a thrift store on Main Street, laid out across the parlor floor because it was the only room that still had glass in every window. No electricity. A single battery lantern threw a small circle of yellow light against walls that seemed to stretch up forever into darkness the lantern couldn't reach. The house made noises after dark. Long, low groans that traveled through the framing when the wind shifted outside. A creak somewhere upstairs, then another like footsteps that weren't there. Ruth lay on her back and listened with her eyes open. Arthritic hands folded over her chest and told herself the same thing 3 times before she believed it even a little. "It's not ghosts," Frank said beside her eyes-closed voice, already half asleep. "I know it's not ghosts, Frank. Wood contracts when the temperature drops. Exterior walls cool faster than the interior framing. Differential, stress, the house is just adjusting. I know. I've been married to you 50 years, Frank. I know how houses breathe." He smiled in the dark. She could hear it in his silence, that particular quality of quiet that meant he was smiling even though she couldn't see it. Even now, even after everything they'd lost in the last 3 weeks, he could still do that to her. She didn't sleep, though. Not really. The floor was hard and her hip ached in the specific way it had ached every night for the last 2 years, and the house was still a stranger to her. All those staircases and towers pressing down from above like something not yet fully understood. Sometime after midnight, she gave up trying and got up instead, lantern in hand, walking the first floor slowly. Not searching, just learning the shape of the place, the way you learn a new neighborhood, by walking it in the dark, letting your feet find the edges your eyes couldn't yet see. She ended up in the back corner of the parlor. The lantern caught something she'd missed in daylight. A piano bench. Oak. Simple. A hinged lid. No piano anywhere near it. The room around it stood empty, just bare floor and dust, but pressed into the wood beneath it were 4 circular dents, deep and unmistakable, where piano legs had stood for years, maybe decades. Ruth sat down on the bench without deciding to. She lifted the lid, empty except for a fine layer of dust in one piece of yellowed cloth folded neatly in the corner. She closed the lid slowly, sat with her hands in her lap. Her knuckles ached thick and swollen at every joint the way they'd ached for 5 years now. She had taught piano for 30 of those years before this. She'd been good at it. Not famous, never that. But good in the way that mattered, the kind of teacher whose students went on to win things, whose fingers on someone else's fingers taught more than any book ever could. Then the arthritis came. Slow at first, then not slow at all. One morning she'd woken up and her hand wouldn't close far enough to reach an octave, and that had been the end of it. No dramatic final concert. No goodbye. Just a quiet stopping, the kind nobody makes a fuss over, and a piano that sat untouched in a living room until her own son sold it without asking. She hadn't cried when Bradley sold the house. She hadn't cried when Carol said the timing wasn't good. She hadn't cried when Mitchell changed his number. She let herself cry now. Quiet. Alone. In the dark on a piano bench with no piano in a house that had clearly gone a very long time without anyone sitting exactly where she was sitting. Frank found her there at first light sky just beginning to gray through the tall windows. He didn't say anything. He sat down beside her on the bench, and together they watched the first morning this room had seen in years spill slowly across the floor. Breakfast was crackers and bottled water on the porch steps. The morning was cool birds working the overgrown yard somewhere down the street, a screen door banging shut, and then footsteps on the walk. Nora, wicker basket in one hand, a rain jacket over her arm, despite a sky that hadn't threatened rain in days. "Saw the lights last night," she said, climbing the steps like she'd been walking them for years. "First time this house has had a light on in about 60 of them. Battery lanterns," Frank said. "Still counts." She handed him the basket. Muffins, a thermos, 2 apples, a block of cheese wrapped in wax paper. "Don't argue with me," she said before either of them could. I made too many this morning. Somebody's got to eat them before they go stale. Ruth came down the last step and Nora looked at her, really looked the way people rarely look at each other anymore, and something in her face softened further. How's the haunted house treating you? Floor's hard, Ruth said. Nobody's died yet. Nora laughed a short, bright sound that seemed to surprise even her. She looked between the two of them, standing there in the wreck of a doorway, 71 and 74 years old one night, into owning a leaning tower nobody else in the county would touch. She didn't say anything about pity, didn't say anything about how sad it all was. She just said, "My restroom's open any time. Kitchen too if you need to heat something up. I open at 6. Nora, you don't have to do that, Frank said. I know I don't have to. She was already walking back down the steps. That's why I'm offering. They ate on the porch, the leaning towers rising above them against a sky that couldn't decide whether to clear. Tell us about this place, Ruth said finally. Nora poured herself coffee from the thermos and settled onto the step below them, the way you settle in when you're about to tell a story you've told before but never get tired of telling. Agnes Winterbourne, she said, music teacher, piano mostly, gave lessons right here in this parlor for years. Husband died overseas, left her to raise their daughter alone. A daughter, Ruth said. Something in her chest went very still. Eleanor. Nora nodded slowly. Everybody in this town knew that girl's name. Played the piano like something out of a dream. My mother used to say you could stand out on the sidewalk on a summer evening and hear her practicing through the open windows, and people would just stop. Stand there. Listen till it got dark. What happened to her? Nora's face changed just slightly, the way a sky changes right before weather. She was 17, accident on the county road threw her off a cart. Hurt her hand bad enough the doctor said she'd never get the fine control back. Not the kind you need to play like that. A pause. Didn't stop her, though. Not really. She kept at it. Just different. Fewer recitals. More time up in that tower room alone. And then, pneumonia. 19 years old. 4 days start to finish. The porch went quiet. Even the birds seemed to pause. Agnes never came back from it, Nora said. Sealed off the top floor not long after. Nailed the door shut and plastered right over where it used to be. Couldn't stand to look at it, my mother always said. Lived down here alone after that. Stopped teaching. Stopped going to church. Just stopped. Ruth looked up at the tallest tower, the one that had looked from the road exactly like the lid of a piano thrown open to the sky. There's still something up there, she said quietly. Not a question. Something's been up there for 60 years, Nora said. Nobody's ever gone looking hard enough to find out what. She stood, brushed off her apron, looked once more at the leaning silhouette above them, like she was seeing it fresh, the way you see something old suddenly for the first time. You really going to fix this place up? That's the plan, Frank said. Then I'll be back tomorrow and the day after that. She turned at the bottom of the steps. That porch could use a friend. She was halfway down the walk when a boy appeared at the end of it. 17, maybe. Tall, thin, a baseball cap, pulled low work boots that had clearly seen real use. He stood at the edge of the yard with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, staring up at the towers with an expression Ruth recognized immediately because she'd been wearing it herself less than a day ago. Danny. Nora nodded at him as she passed. Go on, introduce yourself. The boy didn't move for a moment, just kept looking up. That thing's been leaning as long as I've been alive, he said finally. Never once thought I'd see anybody standing in front of it. Neither did we, Ruth said. He looked at her then, really looked, the same way Nora had. You need help with anything. Frank studied him for a long second. You know which end of a level goes up. I know which end goes up. That's a start. That afternoon, Frank began his list porch supports, first, then roof, then windows, written in small, careful handwriting on the back of the auction receipt. Danny showed up without being asked and stayed without being paid. Not yet, not that first day. Ruth watched them from the porch steps, this old man and this young stranger working together on a structure so large it seemed to swallow the sound of their hammers whole. She climbed the stairs alone while they worked, slowly, one hand on the railing testing each step the way Frank tested boards. The second floor held 4 bedrooms in various states of ruin, wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips, a brass bed frame pushed into one corner untouched by anyone in decades. She kept climbing. The staircase narrowed as it rose toward the tower, tightening around her, like the whole structure had somehow gotten smaller and closer all at once. At the top, a short hallway. 2 doors on the right opening onto small rooms, servants' quarters, empty now, except for dust and the ghosts of old wallpaper patterns. At the end of the hallway, there was a wall. Ruth stopped walking. It looked like any other wall, plastered, papered in a faded floral pattern. But something about it pulled at her the way an unfamiliar cord pulls at a trained ear before you can name what's wrong with it. She crouched, ran one stiff finger along the baseboard. Pine. Everything else in this house, every joint, every frame, every board Frank had tapped and listened to and nodded at was oak. She stood, looked at the wallpaper again. The pattern was close to the rest of the hallway. Not quite the same. The repeat in the print sat a half-inch off like a song played almost perfectly except for one note that lands just slightly wrong. She knocked on it with one knuckle. The sound came back hollow, thin, an echo with empty air behind it. Not the solid thud of plaster over lath over honest framing. Ruth pressed her palm flat against the plaster and stood there a long moment, feeling for something she couldn't yet name. And somewhere behind that wall, through inches of old plaster and older wood, she felt it. The faintest draft of cool, stale air, pushing gently back against her skin. She didn't call for Frank right away. She stood there at the end of the hallway, hand against the wall, and closed her eyes, and for one strange moment she could have sworn she heard it faint, distant, impossible. A single note. Held. Fading. Then she went to find her husband. Frank came up with his tools that same afternoon. He set the hammer down against the baseboard, looked at the wall the way he'd once looked at bridges before signing off on them, and shook his head slowly. "Somebody built this after the fact," he said. "This isn't original." "I know. You knew before I told you." "I felt it." He didn't argue with that. Not anymore. Not after $12 in a tower that shouldn't be standing. He swung the hammer and a chunk of plaster fell away in a cloud of fine white dust, and behind it a layer of thin wooden lath, and behind that a gap of maybe 4 inches, and behind that, caught in the beam of his flashlight, a door. Oak. Dark. Heavier than anything else in the house had a right to be. A brass knob gone black with tarnish. A keyhole waiting for a key that had been sitting on the narrow ledge above the frame the entire time, exactly where somebody had left it on purpose 60 years ago for whoever eventually found their way this far. Frank found the key first, held it up to the light like it might dissolve if he wasn't careful. She couldn't destroy it, he said quietly, but she couldn't leave it locked away forever either. Ruth took the key from his palm. Her hand shook. Not from the arthritis this time. The lock resisted, then turned, a click that echoed down the narrow hallway. The door opened, and the smell hit first, not dust, not rot. Paper, varnish, something underneath it all that might have been dried flowers pressed flat between decades nobody had touched. Golden light fell through 2 tall windows on the far wall, pale bars cutting across a floor covered in everything. Sheet music, stacked on chairs, piled against a low bookshelf, hundreds of pages handwritten in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. And in the center of the room, draped in a white sheet, gone yellow with age, a shape they both recognized immediately. Ruth crossed the room without deciding to move her feet. She pulled the sheet away in one motion, and it slid to the floor in a soft collapse of cotton. And there it was. A grand piano. Ebony case dulled by 6 decades of stillness. No cracks, no warping. sealed tight enough that time itself seemed to have forgotten to visit. She lifted the fall board. Yellowed ivory keys stared back up at her. She pressed middle C. The note came out flat, muffled, but it came out. The hammer still struck. The strings still remembered how to sing. "It needs tuning," Ruth said. Her voice barely made it out of her throat. "But it works." She sat down at the bench, a real bench this time, cushion matching. Her body remembered the motion before her mind caught up 40 years of muscle memory settling into place like it had never left. On the music stand above the keys, someone had left a composition open, a title written in careful fading script, "For Hands That Remember." Ruth stared at it, because that couldn't be an accident. Because nothing about the last 2 days had felt like accident, not since the moment she raised her hand at that auction. "Frank?" Her voice cracked. "Look at the fingerings." He came and stood behind her, and even though he didn't read music, even he could see it. Pencil markings above and below the notes numbers indicating which finger played which key, except they weren't standard. The intervals were wider, spread differently. "Somebody designed this," Ruth whispered, "for a hand that couldn't reach what a normal hand reaches." She placed her fingers on the keys, her swollen knuckles, her stiff joints, the fingers that hadn't spanned an octave in 5 years. She played the first chord. It was full, open, every note within reach. She played the second, then the third. Then the whole first phrase and the melody rose out of that dust-choked room and spilled through the open door and down the spiral staircase, and Ruth's eyes filled without her permission, and her hands kept moving anyway, because for the first time in 5 years, her body wasn't fighting the music. The music was fighting for her. Danny found them there 20 minutes later, standing frozen in the doorway with his cap in his hands, and behind him Nora crying before she'd even registered what she was hearing. "That's her," Nora said. "That's Eleanor. My mother described it 100 times, said it sounded like somebody talking to you from a long way off." Ruth finished the piece, set her hands in her lap. "It does," she said quietly. "It really does." They found the letter 3 days later, sealed in an envelope on a small writing desk in the corner. 4 words on the front in the same careful hand. "To whoever finds this." Frank read it aloud. Ruth stood by the piano, one hand resting on the closed lid, and Danny leaned against the door frame with his cap forgotten in his hands. Agnes had written it the year after Eleanor died. 43 compositions, she said. Written in 3 years by a girl who knew her hand would never work the way it used to, and decided to write music that didn't need it to. Adapted fingerings, simplified voicings that still sounded whole. Music for anyone who'd been told they couldn't play anymore. And at the bottom, a bank account. $800 deposited the year Eleanor died. Left in trust, growing quietly for 6 decades. For the house, Agnes had written. And for music. Music for those who need it most. Frank folded the letter slowly. "There's a condition," he said. "I found the paperwork at the bank yesterday. It's not a deadline. It's a person." He looked up at Ruth. "The trust doesn't release until somebody actually teaches this method to a student. Not files it away, not studies it. Teaches it. To a real person with a real hand that needs it." Ruth looked at the piano. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "I know what I'm doing next." She didn't have to wait long. A woman knocked on the door the following Tuesday, a girl of about 11, standing behind her, holding her right hand slightly curled against her chest, like she was protecting something. "Are you the piano teacher?" the woman asked. Ruth hadn't called herself that in 5 years. "I used to be. My daughter Callie wants to learn. She's got a situation with her hand." The girl lifted it, 2 fingers stiff, scarred. An accident from the look of it, one that had already taught her at 11 years old exactly what the word can't sounded like. "We saw 2 teachers already," the mother said. "Both said she'd never play properly." Ruth looked at the girl. The girl looked back with the specific stubbornness of someone who'd already decided not to believe the last 2 people who told her no. "Come in," Ruth said. 20 minutes later, Callie was playing a simple melody with both hands, her damaged fingers finding the exact spacing Eleanor had built for exactly this kind of hand, and the notes came out clean. Whole. Not a diminished version of real music. Just real music built for a different shape of hand. Callie smiled. First time since she'd walked through the door. Ruth had to look away for a second, because her own eyes had gone hot, and because some things you can't explain to an 11-year-old not yet. Because Eleanor had written this 70 years before Callie was even born for a hand she'd never see, and somehow it fit. The house kept changing around them that same month. Danny showed up every morning now, whether Frank paid him or not, though Frank did fairly once the trust cleared, and together they rebuilt the porch, board by board, post by post, until the whole structure stopped leaning quite so hard toward collapse, even if the tower itself never would stop tilting entirely. That lean Frank had decided was original, a compensation for shifting ground a century old. Not a flaw, a feature nobody in this town had understood until now. Nora came every evening with dinner in a paper bag and stayed longer each time. Carol called once that first week. A short call. Ruth answered it standing in the yard with paint on her hands. "I heard from Bradley you bought some old house," Carol said. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone testing water before deciding whether to step in it. $12. Is that even legal? Perfectly legal, Ruth said. A pause on the line. "Mom, I know the timing wasn't. I'm not upset with you anymore, Carol." And she found saying it that it was mostly true. "I don't have room in me for it right now. I've got a roof to help pay for." Carol didn't call again that month, but she didn't hang up angry either, and Ruth chose to hold on to that small, as it was the way you hold on to anything that isn't a closed door. And then on a Wednesday afternoon, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Ruth was upstairs with Callie working through the second page of a beginner piece when she heard the car door. Something in her chest went cold before she even looked out the window. Bradley got out first. Then a woman in a gray blazer carrying a leather folder pressed flat against her side, like a weapon she hadn't drawn yet. Ruth met them at the door before Frank could. "Bradley." "Mom!" He looked past her into the foyer at the freshly painted trim at Danny's tools stacked neatly by the stairs, at all the evidence that his parents had built an entire life here without him. Something flickered across his face. Ruth couldn't tell if it was guilt or irritation. Maybe both. Maybe those had started looking the same to him a long time ago. "This is Ms. Prescott," he said. "She's an attorney." Ruth's stomach dropped straight through the porch boards Frank and Danny had spent 3 weeks rebuilding. An attorney for what exactly? Bradley's hands went into his pockets. The same gesture he had made as a teenager right before asking for something he already knew the answer to. "Can we sit down, Mom?" They sat at the kitchen table. Frank came in from the yard dust on his shirt, and the temperature of the room dropped another 10 degrees the second he saw his son's face. "Say it, Bradley," Ruth said. "Whatever it is, just say it." Bradley looked at the attorney. The attorney opened the folder. "Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Ashworth, your son has filed a petition." A pause practice professional, the kind of pause lawyers learn to use like a scalpel, "for guardianship of your financial affairs." Silence. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, faintly, Callie was still playing the same 8 bars over and over, patient, careful, completely unaware that the floor beneath her teacher had just tilted harder than any tower in this house ever had. "Guardianship," Ruth repeated, flat, like the word didn't fit in her mouth. "You're 71, Mom." Bradley's voice had the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this in a car on the way over. "Dad's 74. You bought a condemned house for $12. You've now got over $100,000 in a trust account you didn't know existed a month ago, and you're planning to give piano lessons to strangers' children in a building that 3 engineers wouldn't certify." "I certified it," Frank said. Quiet. Dangerous quiet. "You're retired, Dad. You haven't held a license in 6 years." "I built bridges for 40 years, Bradley. I know what standing looks like." "That's not the point." Bradley's jaw tightened. "The point is, you're both making decisions that don't look rational. to anyone outside this house, and I have a responsibility. You have a responsibility. Ruth's voice came out sharper than she meant it to, sharp enough that even Bradley flinched. Do you remember when I said that to you 5 years ago? When my hand stopped working? When I called you and told you I couldn't teach anymore? Bradley didn't answer. Do you remember what you said? Silence. You said it's not like it was paying the bills anyway. Ruth's hands were flat on the table now, every swollen knuckle visible, deliberately visible. That's what you told your mother, the week she lost the only thing that made her feel like herself. Mom, that's not... And then you sold my piano, without asking. Told the movers to deal with it, and they sold it to a second-hand shop for $75. Ruth's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I called that shop Bradley. They remembered you. Nice suit, nice car. Told them your mother didn't need it anymore. Bradley's face had gone the color of old paper. And my ring, Ruth said. The attorney looked up from her folder for the first time. You took it from my jewelry box the day before the house closed, Ruth continued. Drove it to a pawn shop on Meridian Street. Sold it for $400. I know, because I called every pawn shop within 50 miles looking for it, Bradley. They remembered you too. Nobody moved. That ring was the only thing I had left of my mother. Ruth's voice finally cracked just slightly, just enough. And you sold it for $400 because you decided it didn't matter, because you decided I wouldn't notice, because mothers apparently don't get to keep things that matter. Bradley stood up so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. This isn't about the ring. No, Ruth said. It's about whether you actually believe I'm not capable of running my own life, or whether you just don't want to watch me run it without your permission. The attorney closed her folder slowly, looked at Bradley. Looked like she'd just realized she'd walked into a room she hadn't been properly briefed on. Mr. Ashworth, she said carefully, perhaps we should discuss the filing details another. There's a hearing, Bradley said, ignoring her, looking only at his mother now. In 3 weeks, a judge will decide whether you and Dad are competent to manage your own affairs. That's it. That's all this is. That's all this is. Ruth repeated, quiet now, quiet in the way that scared people more than shouting ever could. You listen to me, Bradley Ashworth. I taught piano for 30 years. I taught children who went on to conservatories, to symphonies, to lives I helped build with these two hands. She held them up, stiff, swollen, steady. These hands played Eleanor Winterbourne's music for the first time in 60 years 3 weeks ago, and they will play it again in front of that judge if that's what it takes. Bradley didn't answer. He looked for just 1 second like the boy who used to crash his bike into his mother's piano and not understand why she wasn't angry. Then he turned, walked out. The attorney followed, murmuring something about paperwork that nobody in that kitchen bothered to hear. The screen door banged shut behind them. Frank reached across the table and took Ruth's hand. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Upstairs, faintly, Callie had moved on to the next line of music. Slow, careful, getting it right. Ruth closed her eyes and listened, because that was the sound she realized that would matter most in the end. Not an argument, not a document, just a child's hand finding notes it had been told it would never find in a house nobody believed could still be standing. Danny showed up the next morning like nothing had happened, which was exactly what Ruth needed, though she never said so out loud. He worked in silence for an hour, sanding the last stretch of railing before he finally set the block down and looked at her. My grandmother used to talk about this house, he said. Didn't think much of it till last night. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about something she used to say. What's that? She said she took lessons here when she was a girl. He looked up at the tower the way everyone in this story eventually did sooner or later. Said her teacher stopped teaching real sudden. Never said why. Just stopped answering the door one day. Ruth's chest tightened. Agnes, she said. I didn't put it together till I said it out loud just now. Danny shook his head slowly. My grandmother's the last student Agnes Winterbourne ever taught, before she sealed everything up. Ruth sat down slowly on the porch step, the same step where Nora had once handed them a basket of muffins on their first true morning in this town. Because the town had been circling this house the whole time, she realized. 60 years, and it had never really let go. "Bring her by," Ruth said. "Your grandmother. She's on oxygen. Doesn't get around easy. Then I'll come to her." Danny studied her for a second. Something shifting behind his eyes, some calculation about what kind of person says that so easily. "All right," he said, "I'll ask." Ruth walked to Danny's grandmother's house that same afternoon, sat on her porch, and listened to an 81-year-old woman named Vivian describe in a voice thin as paper but clear as a bell the exact sound of a 17-year-old girl practicing scales through an open window 70 years ago. Vivian cried before she finished the second sentence. Ruth held her hand and didn't try to stop her. That evening, Ruth climbed the tower stairs alone, sat at Eleanor's piano, and played through the whole first movement of Four Hands That Remember from memory for the first time. No mistakes, no hesitation, just her hands finally doing exactly what they'd been asked to do. The third-floor window stood open behind her. The music drifted out over the yard, down the street, past Vivian's porch, past Nora, locking up the diner for the night, past a town that had spent 60 years believing this house had nothing left to give anyone. By the time she finished, there were people standing in the yard below. She could hear them faintly through the open window. Not clapping, just standing there quiet in the last light of the day. Ruth sat with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it. Not for the first time, not exactly, but deeper this time, wider the way grief and relief sometimes arrive together, and you can't separate one from the other. Because in 3 weeks, she'd have to prove to a judge that she was capable of running her own life. And for the first time in 5 years, she actually believed it. The 3 weeks moved fast and slow at the same time, the way waiting always does. Callie kept coming on Tuesdays. 2 more students found their way to the door, a retired school teacher with a tremor in her left hand, and a boy of 9 who simply liked the sound of a piano better than anything else he'd ever heard. Frank and Danny finished the last of the exterior trim. Nora organized a schedule nobody had asked her to organize, and somehow made it work anyway. And then it was the morning of the hearing, and the courthouse smelled like floor wax. Same as the one where she'd bought this whole impossible house for $12. Except this time nobody was laughing. Ruth sat at a long table beside Frank, hands folded in her lap, knuckles swollen steady. Bradley sat across the aisle with his attorney. Didn't look at her, just stared at a legal pad like it might tell him something his own conscience wouldn't. The judge was a woman, maybe 55, reading glasses low on her nose, the kind of face that had heard every version of every family fall apart across that same table for 20 years and had learned not to flinch at any of them. "This is a petition," the judge said, "for guardianship over the financial affairs of Ruth and Frank Ashworth, filed by their son." She looked up. "I've read the filing. Now I'd like to hear from Mrs. Ashworth directly." Ruth stood. Her hip ached. Her hands ached. 5 years of arthritis and grief and love, all balled up into 2 fists she forced open before anyone could see them shake. "Your Honor," she said, "I don't have a law degree. I don't have documents in a folder." She glanced at Bradley's attorney. "But I have something I'd like to show the court if that's permitted." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "This isn't usually how these hearings go." "No," Ruth said. "I don't imagine it is." A pause, long enough that Ruth's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Proceed," the judge said. They'd brought the upright, the one from the teaching studio, the one Nora's church had donated, wheeled in that morning by 3 men from the county building crew who'd heard the story secondhand and shown up anyway unasked. Ruth sat at the bench. She lifted her hands, placed them on the keys, and played. For Hands That Remember. The same piece Eleanor Winterbourne had written 70 years ago for a hand exactly like Ruth's own in a room sealed for 60 of those years. Her fingers found every note, every wide interval built for a hand that couldn't stretch the way a textbook said it should. Every chord voiced full and rich despite fingers that hadn't reached an octave unaided in 5 years. The courtroom went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when it realizes it's witnessing something it wasn't prepared for. Bradley looked up from his legal pad. He didn't look away again. When Ruth finished, she folded her hands back in her lap, looked directly at the judge. "That's not something a woman who's lost her mind can do, Your Honor," she said quietly. "That's something a woman who finally found the rest of herself can do." The judge didn't speak for a moment, just looked at Ruth, then slowly at Bradley. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, "do you have anything to add before I rule?" Bradley stood, opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first, because Ruth watched something happen on her son's face in that silence, something breaking loose that had been screwed down tight for a very long time. Guilt, maybe, or the sudden ugly recognition of exactly what he'd become. He stopped, started again. "I filed this because I was scared, not because I thought she couldn't manage her life." His voice cracked slightly. "I filed it because I sold her piano and her ring, and I couldn't undo either one of those things. So I told myself this was about protecting her." He looked at Ruth for the first time since he'd walked in. "It wasn't. It was about not having to look at what I did." Ruth's chest tightened. "Withdraw the petition," Bradley said, to the judge, to the room, to his mother. The judge studied him a long moment. "Petition withdrawn," she said finally. "Case dismissed." The gavel came down soft, barely a sound at all. But to Ruth it landed like the loudest thing she'd heard in years. Word moved through Caulfield the way it always did, faster than anyone could have sent it on purpose. By that same evening, half the town had heard the piano teacher won. The piano teacher played a dead girl's music in front of a judge and made her own son stand down. Nora, without asking anyone, decided the moment called for something bigger than a quiet celebration. And by the following Saturday, she had turned what was supposed to be a small thank you gathering into the first real recital the Winterbourne parlor had seen in over 60 years. Folding chairs borrowed from the church filled every available inch of floor. Callie played first, clean and confident, her once doubted fingers finding every note Eleanor had built specifically for a hand exactly like hers. Vivian sat in the front row in her wheelchair, oxygen tank beside her, tears sliding freely down a face that had waited 60 years to hear this music played in this house again. Bradley stood in the back of the room. He hadn't been invited, not exactly, but he'd come anyway, and nobody asked him to leave. 3 days after the hearing, before that Saturday recital ever happened, a small padded envelope had arrived at the house. No note inside, just an old cassette tape warped slightly at one edge, a strip of masking tape across the label with 4 words written in handwriting Ruth recognized instantly, even faded with age. Bradley, Lesson 12. She'd sat on the porch steps with Frank beside her in an old tape player borrowed from Nora's diner storage room and pressed play. A child's voice, small, frustrated, 9 years old. "I can't do it, Mom." And then her own voice, 30 years younger, endlessly patient, in a way she'd almost forgotten she was capable of. "You can. Try it slower. I've got all afternoon, Bradley. I'm not going anywhere." The tape hissed. Then haltingly, a small hand finding the right notes. Getting it wrong. Trying again. Getting it right. Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth. Because he'd kept it. All these years. Through the divorce from his first marriage, through 3 different houses, through selling his own mother's piano, without asking, somehow, somewhere he'd kept this one tape. He remembered, Ruth whispered. Somewhere in him, he remembered. Frank put his arm around her shoulders and said nothing at all. Because some moments don't need narrating. They just need someone steady sitting beside you while you feel them. Mitchell called that same week before the recital, an unfamiliar number on the screen, an area code Ruth recognized but hadn't dialed back to in 5 months. "Mom." His voice immediately familiar despite the silence between them. "I saw the article. About the house. About the hearing." Ruth closed her eyes. "I should have called the day I heard what Bradley did." Mitchell said, words tumbling faster now, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times in his car, and was terrified of losing his nerve halfway through. I should have called when he sold your piano. I told myself it wasn't my place to get in the middle of it, which was just an easier way of saying I didn't want to deal with it. Why didn't you? Ruth asked. Quiet, not angry, just wanting finally to understand. Because Bradley always handled everything, and it was easier to let him, until it wasn't easier anymore. Until I couldn't stop thinking about you sitting in a driveway somewhere with $300 and nowhere to go. Ruth looked out at the tower rising above the yard, tilted, impossible, still standing after 60 years and after everything. Can I come see it? Mitchell asked. The house. I want to hear you play. It's always been your house too, Ruth said. Come Saturday. There's a recital. He came Saturday, sat in the second row through the entire recital, and when Ruth finally played the last piece herself, he didn't say anything for a long while afterward, just sat there with his hands pressed flat against his knees, eyes wet the way men of a certain generation cry when they've decided finally to stop pretending they don't know how. For that final piece, Ruth had chosen the last composition in Eleanor's collection, the one titled in that same careful fading script, Letter to Someone I Haven't Met. The most complex piece in the whole catalog. The one that demanded real musicianship, real feeling, and exactly the kind of adapted fingering that made it possible for a woman with damaged hands to play it without pain, without compromise, without apology. She played with her eyes closed because she didn't need to see the keys anymore. She'd stopped needing that the day she found this room, the day she realized Eleanor had reached across 60 years and built something specifically to fit the exact shape of loss Ruth had been carrying. When she finished, the room stayed silent a moment too long. Then Nora started clapping, and the room followed. And the sound rolled up through the parlor, up the spiral staircase, up into the tower where the windows stood open, and the afternoon light poured gold across a piano that had waited 60 years for exactly this moment. Carol called 2 days after the recital. Ruth almost let it go to voicemail out of habit before she caught herself and answered. Mitchell told me everything, Carol said, no preamble, about the hearing, about Bradley. A pause. I should have driven out there the day you told me the timing wasn't good. I've thought about that phone call every day since I said it. I know, Ruth said, not cold, just honest. I'm not asking you to forgive that in one phone call, Mom. Good, Ruth said, because I can't. A silence, but not the old kind, not the kind built out of avoidance. Can I visit next month? Carol asked. I'd like to see the house. I'd like to see you play. It's always been your house, too. Ruth said the same words she'd given Mitchell meant just as much this time. Come whenever you're ready. It wasn't everything. Ruth understood that. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, wasn't a single phone call any more than sorry was a single word. But it was a door left open instead of one nailed shut and plastered over, and after everything this house had already taught her, Ruth had come to believe that an open door was most of what mattered. After the applause faded that Saturday evening, a boy of about 12 slipped out the front door and stood on the sidewalk staring up at the leaning tower against the darkening sky. My mom said this used to be the haunted house, he said to no one in particular. Frank, sitting on the porch step with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, looked up at the same tilted silhouette that had once made 3 engineers refuse to sign their names to it. It's not haunted, he said. It just needed somebody to come home to it. The boy shrugged and ran off toward the sound of his own mother calling his name. Ruth came out onto the porch a few minutes later, having said her goodbyes to Callie and her mother to Vivian to Nora, who was already inside stacking chairs without being asked to. Mitchell, who'd promised to come back the following weekend with his own daughter who wanted lessons. She sat down beside Frank, looked up at the tower one more time. Because months ago, that same silhouette had looked from the road exactly like a grand piano thrown open to the sky, keys scattered in the weather silent. And now somewhere behind those tall arched windows, 43 pieces of music were finally being taught to hands that needed them. A foundation with her name and Frank's name printed beside Agnes and Eleanor Winterbourne's would keep teaching them for years after Ruth herself was gone. Her son Bradley sat with them most evenings, now not fully forgiven, not fully healed, but trying what she'd told him once was most of what love actually was. Her daughter was coming next month. Her other son had already promised to bring his daughter's small, curious hands to the same piano bench. Ruth, Frank said quietly. Yeah, you know what I keep thinking about? What's that, $12? He shook his head slowly, the same disbelief he'd worn the very first day standing in front of a house that shouldn't have still been standing. $12 and it gave us all of this back. Ruth looked at her hands, swollen, steady, finally entirely her own again. It didn't give it back, Frank, she said softly. It just reminded me where I'd left it. Above them, the tower leaned into the evening sky exactly the way it had for 60 years, exactly the way it would for 60 more, holding steady against odds nobody in this town had ever fully understood. Not falling, just standing there patient and impossible, the way the best things always seem to until the right hands finally come along to prove they were worth the wait.